Joseph. They also employed a maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had just arrived at the farm on the day of the murders. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the brutal nature of the killings, but the strange events that preceded them, events that suggest the killer or killers had been watching, waiting, and perhaps even living among their victims before striking. In the days leading up to the tragedy, Andreas Gruber noticed footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm, but none leading back. Inside the barn, he discovered a newspaper he didn't recognize. Small items began to disappear from the house. Keys went missing. Strange noises echoed from the attic at night. Most disturbing of all, Andreas confided in neighbors that he felt someone had been inside the house while the family was out working in the fields. He described hearing footsteps in the attic and finding an unfamiliar set of footprints in the fresh snow around the farm. Any reasonable person would have summoned authorities upon discovering an intruder, but Andreas Gruber did not. Perhaps pride kept him from admitting he couldn't protect his family, or maybe he feared ridicule from his neighbors. Whatever his reasons, Andreas kept these troubling events largely to himself, only mentioning them casually to neighbors. This decision would prove fatal. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the killer made their move. One by one, the residents of Hinterkaifeck were lured to the barn, where they met their end by the blade of a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe. The first to die were Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and her daughter, also named Cecilia. The victims were killed by blows to the head from the sharp end of the farm tool. The killer then entered the house, where they found little Joseph, just 2 years old, sleeping in his crib. The child was murdered in his bed. The newly arrived maid, Maria, was killed in her bedroom. What happened next defies explanation. The killer didn't flee after committing these horrific acts. Instead, they stayed at the farm for days. The bodies weren't discovered until April 4th, when neighbors became concerned after young Cecilia missed several days of school, and no smoke had been seen rising from the Gruber's chimney. What the neighbors found was a scene straight from a nightmare. The bodies of Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter were stacked neatly in the barn, covered with hay. Inside the house, they discovered the bodies of little Joseph and the maid. But here's where the case takes an even more disturbing turn. In the days between the murders and the discovery of the bodies, someone had fed the cattle, eaten food from the kitchen, and may have even slept in one of the beds. The killer had made themselves at home. The investigation that followed was thorough for its time, but ultimately fruitless. Police brought in tracking dogs, interviewed over 100 suspects, and even consulted with clairvoyants in a desperate attempt to solve the case. They found the murder weapon, the mattock, at the scene, but it yielded no useful evidence. Robbery was quickly ruled out as a motive, as a significant amount of money was found untouched in the house. The heads of the victims were sent to Munich for examination, a common practice in German forensic science at the time. Tragically, these heads were lost during the chaos of World War II, eliminating any chance of modern forensic techniques being applied to the evidence. As with many unsolved cases, theories about the Hinterkaifeck murders range from the plausible to the fantastical. Some believe the killer was a vengeful former maid who had been dismissed 6 months earlier after claiming the house was haunted. Others suspect Victoria's husband, who was reportedly abusive and had been killed in the Great War. Or had he? A persistent theory suggests he may have faked his death, returned to the farm, and slaughtered his family. Another compelling suspect was a local man with a history of mental illness who reportedly confessed to the crimes on his deathbed. There were also rumors about Andreas's relationship with his daughter Victoria. Little Josef, who was just 2 years old at the time of the murders, was allegedly the product of incest between Andreas and Victoria. Could someone in the community have decided to take justice into their own hands? In 2007, students from the police academy at Fürstenfeldbruck re-examined the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. They concluded that the most likely perpetrator was a former suitor of Victoria's who had been rejected. But without DNA evidence or living witnesses, their findings remain speculative. What makes the Hinterkaifeck case so enduring is not just its brutality, but the psychological horror of knowing that the killer watched the family, perhaps for weeks before striking. The thought of someone hiding in your attic, observing your daily routine, waiting for the perfect moment to attack, taps into our deepest fears about vulnerability and privacy. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved. The farm itself no longer exists. It was demolished in 1923, and a memorial now stands in its place. The locals couldn't bear to leave the building standing after what had happened there. In a remote corner of Bavaria, 6 lives were violently ended by an unknown hand. The killer's identity remains a mystery, along with their motives. Were they seeking revenge, acting out of jealousy, or was there some darker, more unfathomable reason behind the slaughter? We may never know. As we peer back through the mists of time at the tragedy of Hinterkaifeck, we're left with more questions than answers.
Among the deadliest roles in World War I were those of the trench runners and sappers. Runners risked their lives carrying vital messages across shell-torn battlefields under constant enemy fire. Sappers, meanwhile, tunneled beneath enemy lines to plant explosives.
Their killer, who struck each of them down with a mattock, a farm tool similar to a pickaxe. The killer then entered the house where little Joseph lay sleeping in his crib. The child was killed where he lay. Finally, the murderer found Maria in her bedroom and took her life as well. What happened next continues to disturb and perplex investigators and true crime enthusiasts to this day. Instead of fleeing the scene, the killer stayed at the farm for days. In the interval between the murders on Friday night and the discovery of the bodies the following Tuesday, someone fed the cattle, ate food from the kitchen, and even used the chimney to heat the house. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke rising from the Gruber's chimney over the weekend, suggesting that the killer felt comfortable enough to build a fire and warm themselves in the home of their victims. Some have suggested that the killer even slept in the beds, though whether they chose the bed of one of their victims or slept in the bed belonging to the previous maid is unclear. Either way, the thought of the murderer making themselves at home amid the aftermath of their brutal crime adds a level of psychological horror to an already disturbing case. It wasn't until Tuesday, April 4th, that anyone realized something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck. Young Cecilia had missed several days of school, and a salesman who had visited the farm reported that he had seen no one except the dog, which was still tied up outside. Concerned neighbors formed a search party and made their way to the isolated farm. What they found was a scene straight from a nightmare. The bodies of Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter were stacked neatly in the barn, covered with hay as if someone had attempted to hide them. Inside the house, they discovered the bodies of little Joseph and the maid, Maria. The subsequent investigation was one of the largest in German history up to that point. Police brought in tracking dogs, interviewed over 100 potential suspects, and even consulted with clairvoyants in a desperate attempt to solve the case. They found the murder weapon, the mattock, at the scene, but it yielded no useful evidence. Robbery was quickly ruled out as a motive, as more than 700 marks, a substantial sum in post-World War I Germany, was found untouched in the house. If not robbery, then what could have driven someone to commit such a brutal act? The heads of the victims were sent to Munich for examination, a common practice in German forensic science at the time. Tragically, these heads were lost during the chaos of World War II, eliminating any chance of modern forensic techniques being applied to the evidence. As with many unsolved cases, theories about the Hinterkaifeck murders range from the plausible to the fantastical. Many point to the troubled dynamics within the Gruber household as a potential motive. If the rumors about Andreas and his daughter were true, could someone in the community have decided to take justice into their own hands? Others suspect it may have been a former suitor of Victoria's who had been rejected. In a small rural community where everyone knew everyone else's business, romantic entanglements and rejections would have been common knowledge. Another compelling suspect was Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, who was reportedly abusive and allegedly killed in the Great War. Some theories suggest he may have faked his death, returned to the farm, and slaughtered his family. However, military records confirm his death in the war, making this theory less likely. The former maid, who had left the farm 6 months earlier claiming it was haunted, also fell under suspicion. Could her claims of supernatural activity have been a cover for her own sinister plans? Or did she genuinely sense something amiss at Hinterkaifeck, perhaps the presence of the killer already watching the family? A local man with a history of mental illness reportedly confessed to the crimes on his deathbed, but without physical evidence linking him to the scene, his confession remains just another theory among many. In 2007, students from the police academy at Fürstenfeldbruck reopened the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. After months of work, they concluded that the most likely perpetrator was someone known to the family who had a grudge against them. But without DNA evidence or living witnesses, their findings remain speculative. The Hinterkaifeck farm itself no longer exists. It was demolished in 1923, and a memorial now stands in its place. The local community couldn't bear to leave the building standing after what had happened there, as if the very structure itself had been tainted by the horror it contained. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Hinterkaifeck case is not just the brutality of the murders, but the psychological implications of a killer who watches their victims' lives among them undetected and then remains at the scene after committing their crimes. It taps into our deepest fears about vulnerability and privacy, the terrifying notion that danger might be lurking not out in the world, but right under our own roof. Almost a century has passed since that snowy night in Bavaria, when 6 lives were violently ended. The killer's identity remains a mystery, along with their motives. Were they seeking revenge, acting out of moral outrage? Or was there some darker, more unfathomable reason behind the slaughter? As we peer back through the mists of time at the tragedy of Hinterkaifeck, we're left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that's what makes this case so haunting. In the absence of closure, our minds fill in the blanks with our darkest fears. And sometimes, what we imagine is far more terrifying than the truth. The small farming community surrounding Hinterkaifeck was thrust into the national spotlight following the discoveries on April 4th. News of the gruesome killings spread quickly throughout Germany, and soon journalists descended upon the quiet Bavarian countryside, eager to report on what was quickly becoming one of the most shocking crimes in German history. The investigation was led by Inspector Georg Reingruber of the Munich Police Department. From the beginning, he faced significant challenges. The crime scene had been contaminated by the neighbors who discovered the bodies and by curious onlookers who had visited the farm before police cordoned off the area. The remote location of the farm meant that police arrived hours after the bodies were found, further complicating evidence collection. Despite these obstacles, Inspector Reingruber conducted a methodical investigation. Crime scene photographs were taken, measurements were made, and the mattock was collected for examination. The position of the bodies and the nature of their wounds suggested that the killer had approached each victim from behind, striking them with the sharp end of the farm tool with tremendous force.
Among the deadliest roles in World War I were those of the trench runners and sappers. Runners risked their lives carrying vital messages across shell-torn battlefields under constant enemy fire. Sappers, meanwhile, tunneled beneath enemy lines to plant explosives, often facing cave-ins, gas, or surprise encounters underground. Both jobs demanded courage, endurance, and acceptance of near-certain danger. Their sacrifices kept communication and strategy alive in one of history's most brutal wars.